your admissions officer is finished presenting you to the committee, the committee takes a vote on whether to admit you or to reject you or to waitlist you or do whatever is relevant at that stage. In order to get in, now don't take this, the committee vote must be unanimous. That means the dozen or so people must all agree to let you in. Now, it's not exactly that strong because if it's like 11 to 1, the 11 people are going to pressure the last holdout to let you in. They're going to say, come on, and then whoever will be okay, fine, let him in. But the takeaway point here is that if there are 12 people and they're split 7 to 5 over you, you're not going to get in. You really have to convince the vast majority of the people on this committee that that they want you there. So, what I just described to you, your application going to your regional admissions officer, your officer pushing it through to the committee, and then the committee taking a vote, that's the basic model that your application process will follow. If you apply to Yale and Harvard and Princeton, I know they do very similar things. But that's only the basic model. In the background, there are a lot of considerations that put pressure on that model. First thing is, schools want to maintain the strength of their institutions. By that I mean, they want to have the right kind of talent from their student body to fill a whole orchestra, to fill a band, to fill a chorus. They need strong writers to write for the school newspaper, to write for journals. They need athletes, to be in their athletic teams. And finally, schools need students so that they can make sure some of their undersubscribed academic departments actually have students in them. I didn't realize this at the time, but this is probably one of the things that really worked in my favor. On my application form, when they asked me, what major are you likely to pursue? I mean, I didn't know anything about college at the time, and so I said, I think I marked civil engineering. I marked some kind of engineering. And Yale has been historically very weak in engineering. And so the fact that I marked engineering may probably have made me look more attractive to them. And so all of these considerations play in the background, and they put pressure on this model. Just a sort of side point about the orchestra thing, there's a joke that if you want to go to Harvard, play the bassoon. Because nobody plays the bassoon. There are very few good bassoon players, and colleges always have a really hard time finding bassoonists for their orchestra. And I mean, we joke about it a lot, but it's the basic idea behind it is true. If you have two applicants who are otherwise equal, but one plays the bassoon and one plays the violin, they're going to take the bassoonist if there's only room for one. And so these are just some of the considerations that are lurking in the background as the school's reviewing your file. And then finally, and this will be the last sort of general part of my talk before I open it up to questions, the schools, especially Ivy League schools, they look to maintain racial diversity. They want to make sure that every race is properly, however you define properly represented in their student body. What this means, however, is that for you people, for Asian American applicants, it makes this process a lot more difficult. And there's been a lot of controversy over this in the past few years, but for the foreseeable future, this is going to be the way things are. So, there's a guy from Princeton, Thomas Espenshade, who wrote this book, who was actually advocating affirmative action. But opponents of affirmative action have sort of picked out parts of this book as evidence of why affirmative action isn't working. So he conducted a lot of research on 10 highly selective American colleges, and he found out that African Americans with 1150, this is back when the SAT was 1,600 points, they found that basically Asians who scored perfect 1600s had the same chance of being admitted as white students who scored in the 1460s and African American students who achieved scores of 1,150. And so already you can see that, as far as SATs go and as far as grades go, the standards are much higher for Asian applicants. And in another part of his book, he looked at the average acceptance rate at these, and I don't think he disclosed the list of what colleges he looked at. The only thing he said was that there were 10 selective, highly selective American colleges. He found that, I mean, as you can see, the acceptance rate for Asians is by far the lowest at 17.6%. For whites, it's 23.8%. Blacks is higher, 33.7%. And Hispanics, lower than blacks, but still higher than whites, 26.8%. And so, I mean, if you just look at the statistics alone, it would seem that Asian Americans have a very hard time getting into highly selective American colleges. So I'm not sure if you guys have heard of the case of Jian Li. He's been in the media quite a lot in the last few years. He had a perfect 2400 SAT score. He took 3 SAT 2s, missed only 10 points, and so he had a cumulative SAT 2 score of 2390 out of 2400. He was in the top 1% of a New Jersey high school class, and New Jersey tends to have good public schools. And I didn't include this up here, but he was also president of some club. He volunteered a lot. In other words, he had what seems like it should have been a pretty well-rounded application. Well, he was rejected by Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, MIT, and UPenn, despite all of his qualifications. What ended up happening is he was accepted by Yale, transferred from Yale to Harvard, and then, here's his claim to fame, he filed a federal lawsuit against Princeton for racial bias against Asian Americans. Most people think the lawsuit won't go anywhere because the Supreme Court has pronounced in earlier cases that colleges are allowed to consider race as a factor in the application process. Well, it's kind of a sad story, I guess, for you guys, because once news of this lawsuit came out, both Yale and Princeton, the student newspapers at Yale and Princeton, printed articles very heavily criticizing him about what he did, accusing him of turning a personal defeat into some huge racial problem. And so, I guess the moral of the story is there's not very much sympathy for letting in more Asians into the top echelon of American colleges. And as far as the near future, the foreseeable future, things will stay as they are, and the admission standards, the academic standards for Asians will be much higher. So, I want to bring this back to the first slide, because if you want to think about why the standards for Asians seem to be so much higher than for other races, you need to look back at what the colleges are looking for. Under the first point, there's simply way too many academically qualified Asian American applicants, which means if there are only a certain number of, colleges aren't allowed to have strong quotas, but if you look at the percentages, they sort of like to keep Asian Americans at a certain percentage. So if there are only a limited number of seats and there's so many of you applying, obviously that's going to drive the numbers down. But there's another point here. Asian Americans tend to obsess over elite colleges, and so we have what's called a very high yield rate. A yield rate is the percentage of students who are accepted into a college who end up going. And I don't have statistics to verify this, but I mean, I'm pretty sure everyone in the room will agree with me that Asian Americans, if they get accepted by a very highly ranked college, are very likely or indeed certain to go. This isn't true. This isn't as true with other races. And so since Asians have a much higher yield rate, colleges don't need to let in as many Asians to fill out their spots. So the problem is Asians as a whole in the applicant pool tend to overemphasize academics, and they tend to be weaker in extracurriculars. And especially in this second category of being interesting people you get to know. I was reading a lot of articles and preparing for this talk, and one thing I came across was that I think somebody sued Harvard early in the 90s. Same thing, they thought Harvard wasn't admitting enough Asians. And during this lawsuit, people started combing through a lot of Harvard's application files. And there's this one detail, I think, that captures the crux of the problem for Asian Americans. So as the officers are evaluating you, they write files, and for the file of this one particular Asian American applicant, the excerpt was, "He is a quiet boy, and of course, he wants to be a doctor." So if you think about, what that means in the context of, and I think that is a general stereotype that's imposed on Asian applicants as a whole. But if you think about what that means in the context of what colleges are looking for, it can be very damaging. If you're a quiet boy, which a lot of us tend to be because, we're taught to not raise our voices, be respectful, don't really speak our minds. We tend to be quiet, reserved as a whole. There's less of a chance that you're going to be, an interesting person that someone's really going to want to know. So we lose out. In terms of, the school wanting to create a strong social environment. There's really not much that they feel Asians can contribute to that. But more importantly, this third characteristic, schools looking for students who are determined to change the world. If you think about what that admissions officer wrote, he's quiet and of course wants to be a doctor. I mean, what do you guys want your children to be? Doctors, lawyers, and businessmen, right? You don't want them to go out and change the world and to kick up a bunch of dust. Our priorities, as far as I can, as far as I can observe just by being in this community, are, go to college, go to a good college, get a good, stable job, and be financially secure. That's sort of what our main objectives are. And we completely tend to ignore this very important aspect of what colleges are looking for, and that is sort of cultivating an attitude of wanting to go out, taking the initiative, and sort of accomplishing some great thing in the world that will reflect both well on you and, more importantly, well on the colleges. So this just about wraps up what I have for as far as my general talk. Just two sort of side points. One, as I was talking to this friend of mine who works in the Yale admissions office, he said that the most important thing you can do when you're applying to college is to talk to someone who goes there. Because if you think about it, and I experienced this myself, you get there freshman year, you've gotten in yourself, you meet hundreds of other people who have gotten in. You know what a successful application will look like. So if you're aiming high for one of these colleges, nothing can help you more than to talk to someone who actually goes there. And through talking to them, you can get a sense of what exactly the college is looking for. And since we have, I'd originally prepared this talk for students who are on the verge of filling out their applications. And so I skipped over a lot of the technical stuff, SATs, what you should do in your summer. So in the time we have left, I'm going to open it up to questions, and we can sort of compensate that way. So does anyone have questions about, yes, I know you do.